Morning, friends. I am so glad to be with you today for another episode of Wandering Toward Wonder. That's a time each Tuesday at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard that we get to set aside and spend some time thinking together about cultivating wonder, joy, and hope in our daily lives. My name is Will Green, and I serve as the associate pastor, one of the associate pastors, and director of discipleship at Foundry United Methodist Church in Washington, D.C. I am sure that as we kind of gather ourselves in this morning, there are some of my Foundry friends who are joining in or who will be. But I want to know where you're all tuning in from. So take a minute now to let me know. Drop a note in the chat. Let us know where you're watching from this morning as we gather. I also want to offer, as I always do every time we have this time together, a few ways for you to connect in community at Foundry. We have a number of upcoming classes and Bible studies that will be starting this fall. You can find those every week on Tuesdays in our Connections e-newsletter, and that's going to come out either on our Facebook feed or you can get it directly in your inbox. That newsletter has all kinds of information, not just about classes and small groups, but also about other ministry areas at the church. So let me encourage you to register for that if you haven't already. There's a link that we'll go ahead and drop into the comments section so that you can make sure that you've registered for that if you'd like it. I also want to make sure, if you haven't been tracking this already, that you're aware of Foundry's Family Camp coming up this Labor Day weekend. Foundry's Family Camp has been a long and ongoing ministry at the church this year. We're moving to an exciting and innovative new format that's all virtual with a couple of in-person options. I've gotten to hear some about that from Pastor KC, and I know that she's excited to welcome and is preparing to welcome all of those who will be coming. So you can learn more about that event and register on our website. It's going to be in Connections, so if you're getting that, you'll be able to see it there too. And we really hope that you'll take advantage of that. You know, the real gift is that with it being online, no matter where you are, you can participate in some way. And so we encourage you to receive the full gift of that opportunity in the coming weeks. So as I've been thinking about what to share with you today and doing some of my own wandering toward wonder in this last week, I was recalling an article I had a chance to read a few weeks back by an author by the name of Jennifer Senior. She's a New York Times opinion columnist, and she wrote this piece called "We Hit a Pandemic Wall." And I know at first glance you may read that title with me and go, yeah, and? Because the truth is, this language of kind of pandemizostion, the COVID wall, the summer shutdown, it's all too familiar for many of us who are finding that we're especially threadbare right now. I've been keenly aware as I've visited with friends and colleagues and family members all across the country of how the conflicting and emerging pressures of economic struggle, parenting as we're returning to various iterations of learning, and even just the mental work of envisioning socially distanced or even online holiday celebrations with our family and friends have left a lot of us feeling torn up and worn down and emotionally and spiritually shredded, so to speak, as we seek to try to hold all of the pieces of ourselves together. And when you layer onto that the struggles that we're all anticipating or are directly in the midst of right now, a presidential election, the ongoing pandemic of police brutality, stealing the lives and well-being of our Black and brown neighbors, let alone all those other things we know are still out there that just aren't getting the headlines in the same way, immigrant justice, human rights abuses. It's really in the midst of all of that kind of a wonder we've not been torn apart into psycho-spiritual confetti, right? Bits and pieces of the people we once thought we were. And all of that, right? All of that we're aware of, and all of that makes that article feel a little bit too, perhaps on the nose. But what made Miss Senior's article so timely, I think, is precisely the fact that it was on the nose, that it forces us to acknowledge once more that we're not okay. So many of us, as we continue going through this thing, have a tendency, at least I know I have, of riding this wave, right? Of, oh my God, it's all on fire, to I'm a strong, independent person who's going to make the most of this time and fix all my relationships and lose all the weight and do all the things in my house, to I can't be bothered to worry about what happens tomorrow, before finding ourselves back at wave one, so to speak, squarely back in the it's on fire camp. Her article then is just another periodic reminder that it's okay not to be okay, and invites us, at least me, to remember that no matter how much I might try to talk myself into feeling better, being more confident in myself in a given moment, or convince myself that everything's going to be okay, that there are plenty of moments when, no matter my good intentions and my eloquence, I'm not going to be able to do that, right? I'm not going to be able to talk myself into this thing that I know on some level isn't true. And when I have to confront the fractures that have appeared in my kind of pre-pandemic sense of self, and acknowledge as it crumbles that the bits and pieces left behind are kind of there to be gathered up, what I continue to think about is what it means for us to gather up those pieces and to not reassemble them into the same shape they held before this all began. So if her article is forcing us to acknowledge that we're fractured, forcing us to acknowledge that we're broken, then part of the invitation, I think, is to think about how we're going to put ourselves back together. And at least this is what my wandering around and looking for wonder has left me pondering this week, right? That as we begin to pick up the pieces of ourself, being broken, shattered, fractured, torn under the pressures of these days, we do have this opportunity to begin to reassemble them in a way that more fully reflects the love of God for us, the love of God for the world, and the ways that we feel like God is calling us to show up right now. You know, tell me if you're comfortable, because I'm sure this is probably an experience many of us are having. What good thing about yourself you've learned in pandemic, what strength you have, what ability you had forgotten perhaps, that you've recognized or reclaimed in pandemic. Perhaps there are strengths you've uncovered you didn't know you had, right? Whether it's creating virtual spaces for friends together, perhaps you're a really great online happy hour host. Or perhaps the strength that you've uncovered is the ability to let go of that relationship that in pre-pandemic you clung to with kind of codependent fervor, right? Maybe you've wrestled and realized you've got the strength to wrestle with the doubt and demons of self-loathing and self-sabotage or self-serving behavior that, quite frankly, is just no longer possible in pandemic. And maybe, like Jacob at the Jabbok, you've realized you've got the strength to fight what previously you assumed was just part of the status quo. Perhaps, like me, you've had to recognize that all those things that you did, that you relied on to give yourself meaning, going to the gym, going out with friends, going to the office, or whatever else those things you do might be, maybe what you've had to realize is that those aren't as much a part of who you are as you thought that they were, that maybe the you are is far more complex and far less easily defined than the trappings and comings and goings of the life we lived before. And I lift all this up because I think, as we become aware of these strengths, as we begin to pick up the pieces, what I hope that we're able to do, what I hope that I'm able to do, is to avoid making this kind of overly sentimental mistake that we so often make in moments of crisis or challenge. This overly sentimental mistake that our primary effort should be protecting or returning to the good old days before, to avoid this view of self as a static thing of goodness or wholeness around which the world and everything in it is moving. I'm reminded that we had this almost autoimmune response to defeat anything in the world that would challenge the sense of self that makes us who we are. And I can't tell you how many times as I think about this, I've heard people misquote that line from Psalm 139, reminding us that God knit us together and that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, using that to justify recalcitrance and our fear of change, our longing to return to the world and life we once knew, rather than stepping into the brave space that's available to us when in the midst of brokenness and challenge we're given an opportunity to envision something new. As if God putting down our knitting needles, as if God put down her knitting needles in the moment we were born, right? As if God is only in the work of using whole cloth or virgin yarn and knitting us together. In fact, I think we find that it's precisely in the moments that we find ourselves in right now when we're left holding the pieces of a shattered self that God is most known for entering into the situation and through Spirit's leading, providing a vision for a new way of being, a new sense of self that is knit together, not in some Frankenstein look-alike version of who we once were, but into something that is far more beautiful, far more life-giving, far more powerful a witness to God's love than who we were before. So, think about Jacob, who when he met God at the Jabbok, was preparing to confront the brother whose birthright he'd stolen for the very first time since he'd fled home. Hadn't seen the man in years. And meeting him was a risk. It risked tearing apart everything he thought to be true about who he was and everything that he had built. Think about Mary, who was an unwed woman in a world where giving birth outside of marriage spelled social, if not actual, death. Choosing to carry the life that was Jesus meant risking everything. Everything. Consider Peter. God bless Peter, who was always stepping into one mess or another and earning Jesus' ire for his overzealousness, his anger, and his impatience. Consider Paul, who was actively going around murdering Christians and was blinded before he was able to receive the gift of God's call in his life, which he had to get from one of the very persons he was persecuting. These are incredibly broken people, fractured people, people who are dealing with the complex pressures of a world that is not all that forgiving or kind. And yet it's because of their brokenness, not despite of it, because of their challenges, not in spite of them, that we remember their stories and look to them for guidance as to how to live. And it's not because they remained unmoved or unchanged, put together, or perfect throughout the challenges they faced, is it? No, it's because they invited God to enter into their lives and to, as they were picking up the pieces caused by the various fractures in the moments they were experiencing, invited God to do something more than what they had previously thought was possible. And indeed, God did. I've got a visual aid I want to share with you for a second. This is a quilt that I keep hanging. You can kind of see it there. On the wall of my home. And this is a quilt that my great-great-great-grandmother quilted for my great-great-grandmother years and years ago. It's a fragment. The quilt is very old. And if you look closely at it, what you begin to realize is that it is made of pieces of old clothing, shirts and dresses and pants, pieces of flour sacks that had been worn out by their use. They were threadbare to the point they could no longer be worn. And yet, my great-great-great-grandmother painstakingly cut these individual pieces of cloth, pieced them together, paying attention to the colors and the fabrics and the ways they would join, and made out of them this beautiful tapestry that both honors what the individual pieces had once been and also creates something new that serves a fresh purpose. And I think in some ways, this is what God does with us and for us when we acknowledge the pandemic wall, or when we acknowledge the place where we just can go no further, when we're forced to name the fractures and to pick up the pieces. That God is able to take all of those things, and in a way that only God can, begin to piece them together, knit them together, in a way that both honors who we've been and creates for us a fresh purpose. A fullness of life from which we're able to more fully witness to God's love in the world. So let me encourage you in this season. This is certainly something I'm encouraging myself to not rush past picking up the pieces that you're becoming aware of, or perhaps increasingly are aware of in these days. Don't busy yourselves trying to force them back into a semblance of what they once were, right? As this thing continues to shift and change, let me encourage you to take this opportunity not to recreate something from the good old days, but to sit with them here at this metaphorical wall we find ourselves at, to familiarize yourself with the pieces of you that feel broken and tired and exhausted. Grieve that which needs to be grieved, because certainly there is grief in these days. Celebrate that which you're ready to let go of, to exorcise from your life. And then invite God into the mess, to do what God does best, to knit us back together. Friends, I hope that this has been a word which has spoken a little bit to you and where you find yourselves today. Thank you for taking the time to join me. I hope that you'll continue to check back regularly on Facebook, where you'll receive all kinds of updates about things going on at Foundry. Pastor Ginger will be with us tomorrow at noon for her ponderings from the Purple Parlor. And of course, be sure to check back later on this afternoon around 5 for that Connections e-newsletter. Remember, always be gentle with yourselves. Know that God loves you, and I do too. And keep wandering, friends, toward wonder. Until next time, take care.